It was a quiet night in Oakwood, a small, wealthy suburb where most people knew each other and every street was lined with neatly trimmed hedges. Alicia Moreno, a respected federal prosecutor, was driving home after a long day at work. Her car, a simple but reliable sedan, moved steadily through the streets. She wasn't speeding or doing anything wrong. She was just tired and eager to reach home. Suddenly, the red and blue lights of a police car flashed in her rearview mirror. The piercing sound of a siren followed. Alicia sighed and pulled over, unsure why she was being stopped. She hadn't broken any laws, and her mind raced through possibilities. Maybe her taillight was out. Maybe there was a mix-up. The officer who approached her car was Darren Mitchell. He had been on the force for years, and while some praised his strict approach, others quietly questioned his methods. Darren walked up to Alicia's car with a stern expression, his flashlight aimed directly at her face. "License and registration," he said curtly, his tone sharp and demanding. Alicia nodded politely. "Of course, officer. Can I ask why I'm being stopped?" she asked calmly, keeping her hands visible on the steering wheel. Darren didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked her over, his expression hardening. "I'll explain once I see your ID," he said. Alicia carefully reached into her bag, pulling out her driver's license and the badge that identified her as a federal prosecutor. "Here you go," she said, handing them to him. When Darren saw her badge, his demeanor didn't change. In fact, his frown deepened. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" he asked suddenly, his voice cold. Alicia blinked, surprised by the question. "I live here," she replied. "Is something wrong?" Instead of answering, Darren began asking more unnecessary questions, his tone growing more confrontational. Alicia tried to stay calm, but she could feel the tension rising. Something about this stop didn't feel right. As their exchange continued, a small group of onlookers began to gather on the sidewalk. One of them pulled out a phone, quietly recording the scene. Alicia noticed the phone and felt a wave of relief. If something went wrong, there would be proof of what happened. Darren seemed to notice the onlookers too, but it didn't stop him. His tone became sharper and his actions more aggressive. Alicia stayed firm, keeping her voice steady as she answered his questions, but her heart pounded in her chest. The situation escalated quickly. Darren's behavior became erratic, and his hand moved toward his holster. Alicia, still sitting in her car, held her hands up and said, "Please, there's no need for this." But before she could say more, a loud commotion broke out from the growing crowd. The tension in the air was unbearable, and in that moment, Alicia's life was about to change forever. The night of the traffic stop quickly became the center of attention, not just in Oakwood but across the country. The video taken by a bystander spread like wildfire. People couldn't believe what they were watching. The clip showed Alicia Moreno calmly speaking to Officer Darren Mitchell, clearly trying to de-escalate the situation. Then, without reason, the scene turned chaotic. The video stopped before the worst of it, but it left enough questions to ignite outrage. Alicia was rushed to the hospital after the incident. Thankfully, her injuries weren't life-threatening, but they were serious enough to require immediate medical attention. As a federal prosecutor, she had worked on countless cases, always advocating for justice and fairness. Now she found herself on the other side, fighting for her own rights and safety. The next day, Alicia's name was all over the news. Reporters stood outside her hospital, trying to get a statement. The public quickly learned who she was, a respected lawyer who had spent her career upholding the law. This revelation made the story even more shocking. How could something like this happen to someone who dedicated their life to justice? Meanwhile, the police department faced enormous pressure. Protests erupted in Oakwood and nearby cities. People held signs that read, "Justice for Alicia," and "No one is above the law." The peaceful demonstrations brought together people of all backgrounds, united by a shared outrage over what had happened. Within the department, the atmosphere was tense. Darren Mitchell's actions were being questioned by everyone, from his colleagues to his superiors. The department announced that an internal investigation had begun, and Darren was placed on administrative leave. While this was a standard procedure, many people felt it wasn't enough. Alicia, still recovering in the hospital, received an outpouring of support. Flowers, letters, and messages of encouragement filled her room. She was overwhelmed by the kindness of strangers who believed in her and wanted to see justice served. Despite the pain and stress, Alicia remained composed. She knew she had to stay strong, not just for herself, but for everyone who had experienced similar situations. In the days following the incident, more information about Darren Mitchell's past came to light. Reports surfaced about complaints filed against him by other citizens. While none of these complaints had led to disciplinary action before, they painted a troubling picture of someone who had been allowed to stay on the force despite a history of questionable behavior. As the community rallied behind Alicia, calls for accountability grew louder. The mayor of Oakwood held a press conference, promising a full investigation and transparency. "We cannot ignore what happened," she said. "We owe it to our community, and we owe it to Ms. Moreno." The stage was set for a legal battle that would test the integrity of the system. Alicia knew her journey for justice was just beginning, and she was ready to face whatever came next. The story of Alicia Moreno's shooting spread quickly across the country, and the reaction was swift. It wasn't just Oakwood that was upset. People from all over the nation were shocked by what had happened. Social media was flooded with posts demanding justice for Alicia and calling for the immediate firing of Officer Darren Mitchell. Hashtags like #JusticeForAlicia and #AccountabilityNow trended for days. The protests, which had started small in Oakwood, grew larger and more widespread. In every major city, people took to the streets, holding signs and chanting slogans. They were not just angry about what had happened to Alicia, but about the larger issue of racial profiling and police misconduct that had been a problem for far too long. While some protests were held peacefully, others turned chaotic as frustration boiled over. Alicia, despite being in the hospital, became the face of the movement. Her calm and composed demeanor in the video made her a symbol of how things could go wrong even when you tried to cooperate. People were drawn to her story, and they saw in her a person who had spent her life fighting for justice, now finding herself in a situation where the justice system had failed her. On the other side, the police department found itself under immense pressure. The public demanded answers. How could someone like Darren Mitchell, with a history of complaints, still be allowed to serve on the force? The local government was forced to act. The mayor, in a press conference, spoke about how the city would work to restore trust with its citizens. "We need to rebuild the relationship between the police and the community," the mayor said. This was an isolated incident, but it's a reminder of how much work we still have to do. The words sounded good, but many people felt that action spoke louder than words. While the protests continued, there was also a growing conversation about the bigger problem at hand: police reform. Activists and community leaders used the incident as a springboard to call for changes to the way the police operated. They argued for better training, more accountability, and greater transparency within law enforcement agencies. These were not new ideas, but the urgency felt different this time. Meanwhile, Darren Mitchell, now under investigation, stayed silent. His lawyer issued statements saying that Darren had acted in self-defense, but the growing mountain of evidence seemed to contradict that claim. The public wanted to know more. Why had Darren stopped Alicia in the first place? What had caused him to escalate the situation so quickly? As the investigation into Darren's actions unfolded, Alicia's voice was loud and clear. She spoke out, not just for herself, but for the countless others who had faced similar treatment. "I am not the only one," she said in a statement. "There are people in every community who live in fear of what might happen when they encounter law enforcement." Her words struck a chord with many, and soon the call for reform went beyond just holding Darren accountable. People wanted real change. They wanted to make sure that what happened to Alicia would never happen again to anyone else. After days of recovering in the hospital, Alicia Moreno finally felt strong enough to speak out. The whole world had been following her story, and now it was her turn to share what had happened from her perspective. The pain from her injuries was still there, but Alicia knew she had to use her voice. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had been wronged. Alicia sat in front of the microphone at a press conference, her back straight, her hands steady. She had seen plenty of courtroom drama over the years, but now she was in the spotlight in a way she never expected. The eyes of the nation were on her. The room was filled with reporters, cameras clicking as they waited for her to speak. She began by sharing the details of the night she was shot, her voice calm but firm. "I never thought something like this could happen to me," she said. "I'm a prosecutor. I have spent my career upholding the law. But that night, I was treated like a criminal, simply because of who I am and how I look." Alicia paused, looking around the room, making eye contact with the reporters. "What happened to me is not an isolated incident," she continued. "There are countless people across this country who live in fear of being treated like I was. People who fear the very system that is supposed to protect them." Her words were powerful. They resonated with people everywhere, especially those who had long felt the sting of racial bias and inequality. It wasn't just Alicia speaking now. It was a voice for many others who had been unheard for too long. She went on to explain how she had tried to stay calm during her encounter with Officer Darren Mitchell. "I did everything I could to de-escalate the situation," she said. "But in the end, none of that mattered. What mattered was the officer's decision to pull out his weapon and shoot me." Alicia's face remained composed, but anyone watching could see the strength in her eyes. "I want justice, not just for me, but for everyone who has experienced this kind of treatment. We need real change. We need accountability. And we need to make sure this never happens again." Her statement made waves. The media shared it everywhere, and soon it wasn't just local news covering her story. It was national and international. People from all walks of life sent messages of support. Social media exploded with comments and hashtags, expressing admiration for Alicia's courage and calling for justice. In the weeks that followed, Alicia became a symbol of resilience. She received letters from strangers, some thanking her for speaking up, others sharing their own stories of mistreatment. The outpouring of support gave her even more strength, but it also made her realize just how deep the problem ran. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but Alicia knew she was ready. She couldn't change what had happened to her, but she could make sure it would change things for others in the future. The days following Alicia's public statement were filled with tension. The case was now in the hands of the police department, and the pressure to do the right thing was enormous. People everywhere were watching closely, hoping for justice. The internal investigation into Officer Darren Mitchell's actions was underway, but many wondered if the department could truly be trusted to investigate one of their own. The investigation started with a review of all available evidence: the bodycam footage from Officer Mitchell's patrol car, the bystanders' video, and the statements of witnesses who had been at the scene were all examined closely. It didn't take long for investigators to realize something was wrong. Darren's version of events didn't match the video evidence. His report claimed that he had been in danger and acted in self-defense, but the footage told a very different story. Alicia had done nothing to provoke the situation. She had tried to remain calm and cooperative. She had shown the officer her identification and asked why she had been stopped. The video from the bystander clearly showed that Darren Mitchell had acted aggressively without reason. There was no sign of any immediate threat to him. His actions were unjustifiable. As the investigation continued, the department found something even more troubling. Darren Mitchell had a long history of complaints filed against him. These complaints ranged from accusations of racial profiling to unnecessary use of force. However, none of these complaints had resulted in serious consequences. He had remained on the force for years, despite warnings from citizens and fellow officers about his behavior. The department's leadership was forced to confront this uncomfortable reality. How had they allowed a person like Darren to continue working as a police officer? Why had they not acted on the complaints that had been made against him? These were questions they could no longer ignore. The community, meanwhile, was growing impatient. People had been waiting for action. They wanted to know that the police could be trusted to hold their own officers accountable, especially when one of them had done something as serious as shooting a federal prosecutor without cause. The mayor and other local leaders called for transparency and promised that there would be no cover-ups. The investigation, they said, would be thorough and fair. Alicia, still recovering, was watching closely. She knew that the internal investigation could be the turning point in her fight for justice. It wasn't just about her. It was about ensuring that police officers who abused their power were held responsible for their actions. She wanted to make sure that no one else had to experience what she had gone through. As the investigation reached its final stages, the pressure on the police department grew. If they failed to hold Darren accountable, it would only fuel the growing mistrust between law enforcement and the community. But if they did act, it would show that even those in power had to answer for their mistakes. The outcome of the investigation was uncertain. But one thing was clear: the fight for justice was far from over. Alicia knew this was just the beginning. The pressure on the police department had reached its peak. Days turned into weeks, and the community's demand for accountability grew louder. The people of Oakwood were watching closely, waiting to see if Officer Darren Mitchell would face the consequences for his actions. The evidence against him was undeniable, but many still wondered, would the police department truly hold one of their own accountable? Finally, the police chief made an announcement. In a press conference, he revealed that Darren Mitchell had been fired from the police force. The decision came after a thorough internal investigation, which found that Darren had violated department policies and acted outside the boundaries of his authority. After reviewing the evidence, it's clear that Officer Mitchell's actions were not in line with the standards of our department. The police chief said, "We take these matters seriously, and there will be no tolerance for this kind of behavior." For many in the community, this was a victory. It was a sign that the system could work, that even a police officer could be held responsible when they did something wrong. The decision to fire Darren was just one step, but it was an important one. It showed that the department was willing to take action, even when it meant holding one of their own accountable. Alicia, who had been closely following the investigation, felt a sense of relief when she heard the news. She knew this was just the first of many steps, but it was a step in the right direction. For her, the firing wasn't just about Darren losing his job. It was about the message it sent to the rest of the department and to the community. It meant that the system was capable of change, and that people like her, people who were wronged, could stand up and make a difference. The firing of Darren Mitchell, however, did not end the controversy. Many people, especially those in law enforcement, questioned whether this was enough. Some argued that Darren should face criminal charges, while others believed that the department had made the right decision in firing him. The debate raged on in the media, with pundits on both sides offering their opinions. Despite the mixed reactions, the public was still focused on what came next. What would happen to Darren now that he had been fired? What actions would be taken to ensure that something like this never happened again? In the days that followed, Alicia's legal team filed a civil lawsuit against the police department, seeking damages for the harm done to her. The lawsuit would be a long and complicated process, but it was another important step in the fight for justice. Alicia was determined to ensure that the police department would take responsibility for the pain they had caused. For the people of Oakwood and the many others who had supported Alicia, the firing of Darren Mitchell was a victory. But Alicia knew there was more to be done. The journey for justice wasn't over yet. The moment everyone had been waiting for had finally arrived. After weeks of investigations and public outcry, Officer Darren Mitchell was officially charged with multiple offenses, including attempted murder and civil rights violations. The courtroom became the center of attention as the case moved forward, with people from all over the country following every detail of the trial. For Alicia Moreno, this was a moment to finally seek the justice she had fought for since that fateful night. The trial was intense. The courtroom was packed with journalists, legal experts, and members of the public eager to see how the case would unfold. The tension was palpable. Alicia sat in the front row, her eyes focused on the proceedings. She was determined to see this through. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about ensuring that no one else would go through what she had. The prosecution presented a strong case against Darren Mitchell. They began by showing the evidence, videos from the body cam, the bystanders' recording, and witness testimonies that all pointed to one thing: Darren had acted unjustifiably. The footage clearly showed that Alicia had done nothing to provoke the situation. She had cooperated with the officer, yet Darren had escalated the encounter to a point of violence. Alicia's testimony was crucial. She spoke with calm determination, explaining her side of the story. "I never wanted to escalate things. I just wanted to understand why I was being stopped," she said. "But instead, I found myself fighting for my life. I never thought I'd be in this position, and I never imagined it would happen to me." Her words were powerful. They painted a vivid picture of a woman who had always worked to uphold the law, now struggling to get the justice she deserved. Her testimony was heart-wrenching, yet it was clear that she was determined to make sure her experience would help bring change. The defense, on the other hand, tried to argue that Darren had acted out of fear for his life. They suggested that he had perceived a threat and had reacted quickly, but their argument seemed weak. The evidence did not support their claims. The bodycam footage, which showed Darren acting aggressively without cause, was too clear to ignore. The defense struggled to explain how Darren's actions could be justified. As the trial continued, it became clear that Darren's actions had been reckless and without reason. The more the prosecution presented evidence, the less room there was for doubt. Alicia's legal team was confident that they had built a strong case. The facts spoke for themselves. Throughout the trial, Alicia remained composed. She listened carefully to every word, but she never lost sight of the bigger picture. She knew that this case was about more than just her. It was about ensuring that law enforcement officers who abused their power were held accountable. It was about making sure that those who trusted the system to protect them would never have to fear it again. The trial wasn't over yet, but Alicia felt that justice was closer than ever. The fight for accountability had only just begun, but she was ready to face whatever came next. With each passing day, the hope for a fair outcome grew stronger. After a long and tense trial, the day everyone had been waiting for arrived. The sentencing of Officer Darren Mitchell. The courtroom was filled with anticipation. Alicia Moreno, sitting quietly in the front row, felt a mix of emotions. After everything that had happened, this was the moment when justice would either be served or denied. The judge entered the courtroom, and everyone stood in respect. The room settled into silence, with the weight of the decision hanging in the air. Alicia's heart was pounding, and her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. She had spoken out, she had testified, and now it was up to the judge to decide Darren's fate. The prosecutor began by reminding the court of the seriousness of the charges against Darren. He had not just violated department policies, he had committed a crime. The prosecutor laid out how Darren's actions had been reckless and dangerous. The public, the police department, and the law itself had been betrayed by a man who was supposed to protect and serve. The defendant, Officer Darren Mitchell, has shown no regard for the law or the safety of others. The prosecutor said, his actions that night could have cost an innocent woman her life. He must be held accountable for what he has done. Darren, sitting in the defendant's chair, kept his eyes lowered, avoiding the gaze of anyone in the room. His lawyer had attempted to argue for a lighter sentence, citing his years of service and the stress he had faced on the job. But the judge wasn't swayed. The evidence was clear, and the public's demand for accountability was too strong to ignore. Finally, it was time for the judge to deliver his decision. The room grew even more silent, if that was possible. The judge spoke in a calm but firm voice, his words carrying the weight of the law. Officer Darren Mitchell, the judge began, you have been found guilty of attempted murder, civil rights violations, and falsifying your report. Your actions that night were reckless and unjustifiable. You have shown no remorse for the harm you have caused, and you have broken the trust that the people of this community placed in you. The judge paused, allowing the gravity of his words to sink in. Alicia took a deep breath, her body tensing. She had waited for this moment, and now it was here. Because of the severity of your actions, the judge continued, and the damage you have caused, I hereby sentence you to 10 years in prison. A wave of relief washed over Alicia. It wasn't an easy thing to hear, but she knew it was the right decision. Darren Mitchell would no longer be in a position to harm anyone else. His actions had consequences, and for Alicia, that meant something. The justice system had worked in her favor, and it had worked for everyone who had been mistreated or wronged by those who were supposed to protect them. As the courtroom emptied, Alicia stood up, feeling the sense of closure. She had been through so much, but this moment felt like the end of a long and painful journey. There was still work to be done. Her civil lawsuit was next, but for now, she allowed herself a moment of peace. Justice had been served. The courtroom was quiet as the judge's decision was final. Darren Mitchell's sentence of 10 years in prison was a moment of justice for Alicia, but it wasn't just about his punishment. The real change, Alicia knew, was the message this case sent to the world. In the weeks following the trial, Alicia became a powerful voice for reform. She traveled across the country, speaking at events and meetings, sharing her story and calling for change. She was no longer just the victim of an unjust act. She was a symbol of strength and resilience, a person who refused to stay silent in the face of adversity. Justice isn't just about punishment, Alicia said in one of her speeches. It's about making sure that the system works for everyone. It's about ensuring that the mistakes made by a few don't hurt the many. We must hold those in power accountable. Her words resonated deeply with many people. Activists, lawmakers, and ordinary citizens all agreed that there needed to be more accountability in law enforcement. The case against Darren Mitchell had opened the door for conversations about police reform, and Alicia was determined to keep it open. The police department, too, was forced to reckon with its role in the situation. The internal investigation had revealed the failure to address Darren's previous complaints, and now the department had to rebuild its trust with the community. New policies were put in place to ensure better oversight, more thorough training, and a stronger commitment to preventing racial bias and misconduct. The changes in the police department were slow, but they were a start. Alicia's case sparked a wider movement across the country, one that was focused on creating a more fair and just system. While there was still much work to be done, it was clear that the conversation had begun. For Alicia, life was slowly returning to normal, but it would never be the same. She had spent so much of her career fighting for others in the courtroom, but now she was in a fight of her own. She had faced an unimaginable situation, but she had come out stronger, determined to make a difference. As the months passed, Alicia continued to advocate for change. She spoke to lawmakers about the need for more police oversight and better protections for citizens. She worked with organizations that focused on reforming the justice system. And through it all, she kept her message clear. This was not just about one officer or one case. It was about making sure that everyone was treated fairly, no matter their background or their story. Alicia's life had been forever changed by that one night, but she had made sure that her experience would not be in vain. She had turned her pain into a powerful force for good. The fight for justice was far from over, but Alicia was more than ready to keep pushing forward, knowing that every step she took brought her closer to a world where fairness was truly for all.